Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Dana Connors. I am pleased to be your host of this weekly program brought to you every Monday. Let me stop there. From now on, it will not be every Monday. It'll be Tuesdays at noontime. Same program, even though we've changed the time and the date, the program remains the same. We're going to continue to focus on the people, initiatives, and policies at work in our state to improve the lives of Maine people, but also to help grow our economy. And today we have an important issue to discuss with you. It's a national initiative. It's a plan put forward by our president, President Biden, to address the economic fallout from the pandemic and to help kickstart our economy. It's a $2.3 trillion infrastructure and jobs plan. It is simply a proposal at this point. It's bold, it's sweeping, it's ambitious, but Congress will be back, or Congress is back this week, and they'll be taking up this issue and making probably a lot of changes before it's hopefully ultimately approved. So we're going to begin our discussion today with a very special guest. That guest is Ed Mortimer. Ed is the Vice President of Transportation and Infrastructure for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, a subject that he watches closely and is very involved in what is being presented. And we are very grateful that we have him on the show today. As a matter of fact, if you looked at his resume, you would find that he has devoted almost his entire career to transportation. So Ed, welcome and thanks for being with us. It's a real pleasure.
Great to be with you, Dana.
Let's begin. I know that we don't have all the time in the world, and it probably would take all the time in the world to talk about every single detail in that plan, but give us your perception of the overall plan itself. We know it's infrastructure, we know it's jobs, we know it reaches into areas that probably many of us wouldn't initially think it's infrastructure. So give us your sense of what that is all about.
Sure. So, the plan lays out a conversation that we at the U.S. Chamber have been promoting for some time, which is the need to modernize America's infrastructure. As many of your guests probably know, our infrastructure was once the envy of the world, but it's 50 to 100 years old. And we know we've gone from a brick and mortar economy to an e-commerce environment. The way we move is different than the way we did back in the 50s. And so we need to modernize, and state and local governments have been doing their part. It's the federal government that needs that vision and to provide folks like Bruce the opportunity to not just fix old infrastructure, but to think anew, to make sure our infrastructure is interconnected and modern to compete against China and other countries in the 21st century. So President Biden laid out a proposal that is big and bold and something that we are glad is comprehensive. It's not just our transportation networks. It's our water systems, it's our energy grid, clean energy. It's rural broadband for those areas where there wasn't the public sector interest to get broadband access. There are some things in there that are a little broader than the U.S. Chamber's definition of infrastructure. But the bottom line is this is an important comprehensive proposal. And it's a conversation we need to have our elected leaders, both Republican and Democrat, come together to solve for the American people. We've been putting Band-Aids on these issues for too many years, and now is the time that we need to come up with concrete solutions so that we can get, as we're getting out of this pandemic, as we're looking to get our economy back on track, these are long-term investments and they leave assets that every American can benefit for many years to come.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, it's the definition of infrastructure leaves one wondering how some of them fit. At the same time, there's no question that whether they fit that definition or not, what he has put in there, to your point, there are definite needs and they need to be examined and considered at the very least. Congress is back. And we know that there's going to be a lot of debate around the size, what it's being spent for, where the funding comes from. What is it that you see that concerns the U.S. Chamber? Before we talk about where and what you're hearing from Congress, what does the U.S. Chamber have concerns with this plan, if they do?
So I think two major concerns that we have with the plan as introduced One is, again, the scope of infrastructure. Again, there are a lot of things in the care economy that are very important. They need to be addressed. Our view, though, is that this is not the piece of legislation to do that. So that's one concern. The other concern the proposal has introduced calls for paying for all of the infrastructure based on raising the corporate tax rate, which we led the charge to reform the tax code in 2017. We don't think that's the right way to go. We at the Chamber have put out a variety of funding and financing options to invest in modernizing America's infrastructure. For roads, bridges, and transit, we believe you need to adjust the fuel tax. Has been raised since 1993. I think Maine's done it at least once, if not twice, since 93. And we also understand that as we get more electric and alternative source vehicles online, we will probably be transitioning to what we call a vehicle mile traveled, where it won't matter the energy source of the vehicle, it'll be how many miles you travel. There's going to be some national pilot programs in the next legislation, but we need to adjust the fuel tax now. We also need to encourage private investment, because any private investment we can bring in infrastructure frees up limited dollars for those projects that don't make private investment sense. So again, we have a variety of ways to do it. The way we don't want to do it is through raising the corporate tax. And again, we're going to be very strenuous, and we have already reached out to the White House and the Congress. And again, the president's been very open to, he understands this is the start of the conversation. It's not the end. So we look forward to engaging with members of Congress to address and come up with ways to pay for the bill. It needs to be paid for. We think we can pay for it over time, and we have a variety of ways to do so. And we look forward to working with Congress to get it done.
Share with our viewers, what are some of the things you're hearing from Congress, be it the Senate or the House, those who have already expressed some concerns? What does that appear? What do they appear to be, those concerns?
So I think, and again, our politics in Washington is very polarizing at this time. And so unfortunately, many Republicans have just come out and said, this is too much. It's not infrastructure. Others are saying this isn't big enough. Usually somewhere compromise in the middle. Both sides are going to have to give a little bit on this. It's not going to be as expansive probably as the proposal is laid out, but it's not going to be as small as some other people want. But that's what we elect men and women to Congress to do, to come up with tough decisions to benefit all Americans. There's an old saying, there is no Republican road or Democrat bridge. We're all Americans. We need to have this national system. We need to come together with some bipartisan solutions. And your delegation is kind of one that, we look at your two senators, they're on the forefront of encouraging that type of bipartisan solution making. And it's going to take that type of effort to get it done. We've been talking about infrastructure for years. It's a running joke in Washington that every week's infrastructure week. We got to let our elected leaders know we're not going to let them off the hook. Telling us you can't do it because the other side doesn't want to come to the table, that's not an acceptable answer. So we're going to continue to push and encourage all your listeners to talk to your delegation and urge them to convince their colleagues to sit down and come up with some common sense solution to benefit all Americans.
Ed, you said it extremely well. It's a pleasure to have you on Maine Take today, and we certainly look forward to joining with you in terms of addressing something that our economy begs for, and our history proves over time that infrastructure is always present when a president and Congress gets together to try to rejuvenate an economy, and that's clearly where we are today. And so we look for whatever that definition may end up being, and whatever that program in terms of the amount and the expenditures, I've got to believe that to satisfy Maine people, infrastructure, transportation has to be a vital part of that, because every year our people step up on bond issues to address our transportation needs, and they always win by a very strong margin. So that'll be music to their ears, I'm sure. So I thank you a lot for taking the time to be with us. And I'll repeat, I look forward to working with you on this much needed initiative.
Great, Dana. Thanks for the opportunity. Appreciate all the work the Maine Chamber has been doing in promoting our need to get this infrastructure issue addressed. So thanks again.
Our pleasure. It's a great partnership. Thank you very much. Now let's turn our attention to our Commissioner of Transportation, Bruce Van Note, and following him, the Executive Director of our Northern New England Regional Passenger Authority. There we go. Patricia Quinn. They both are in the forefront of meeting transportation needs here in the state. And Bruce, I'm going to turn to you first. Bruce Van Note has been a steward of transportation for as long as I've known him. He has worked for the department for 20 years. A good part of that was as deputy commissioner. We're grateful that he leads our transportation department today. But you also should know that he is a professional land surveyor, he's an attorney, he's an engineer, and now he's commissioner. So Bruce, with all of that, I know this probably is setting you up for an unfair question because, as Ed just mentioned, this is the beginning of a discussion. It is a proposal that has the presence of transportation, but when you think of the number of $615 billion, 20,000 miles of highways, 10,000 small bridges, and 3 economically advantaged or significant, I should say, bridges. That may seem like a lot of money, but we don't know how much of that comes to Maine or in what form it's going to come. What have you learned as this has started to unfold? Has there been any clarity on any of that that would serve your purposes? I've got to believe, and I'll say this, and because I'm sure that you have been put in this position, everybody looks at this and says, oh my soul, with all that money, are you going to need any more? Because you've been a great steward of getting 100 very significant bond issues of 100 million over the years, recent years, and that goes a ways, but doesn't go all the way. So tell us, what do you know so far?
Well, thanks for having me on, Dana. The first thing we know is anytime infrastructure is top of mind in Washington, that's a good time for us. I mean, there have been a lot of infrastructure days, or even, well, they've been mostly days and then maybe 2 days and then fizzled in the past. This has got some staying power. And in some of the past discussions, I've often been quoted as saying, this is potentially exciting, but hope is not a plan. This time I would say it's beyond hope. Now it's coming up with some expectations. And I still have to say expectation, you can't cash expectations. So you really have to wait and find out what happens. We're basically about in the second inning of a 9-inning game. I think they're talking about August before they get done this. And on a parallel track, we have reauthorization of the surface transportation system, which is due the end of September. My guess is those two kind of conversations will kind of merge, and you can't consider one without the other. But focusing back on the Biden infrastructure plan, and it's called the American Jobs Proposal, like you say, about 27% of that is transportation related. And of that, if you're kind of focused in on the transportation related, the largest chunk, almost a third, is for electric vehicle transition, both charging stations and rebates, which is very exciting about the transformation to a clean transportation future. That's what it's going to take. And I don't have any question that that is the future of transportation in this whole country and the state of Maine. The only question is when. You know, how many electric vehicles are there? The personal electric vehicle is going to be central to that in the rural parts of a state like Maine. When you talk about Maine, I won't bore you with the statistics, but we're the least densely populated state east of the Mississippi. We're spread out. We have first-class small cities and villages, and there's a lot of opportunity, and I'm sure Patricia will be talking about what we can do with rail and transit. But for Maine, it's going to be the personal electric vehicle that really is the big transformation. So like 100 billion of that is for subsidies as proposed. So that's a step in the right direction. There's also 500,000 EV charging stations across the country they're talking about. So that could really jumpstart that if that makes it all the way through. And of course, like I say, in a state like Maine, Maine DOT takes care of about 8,800 miles of highway. We have 23,000 public miles, but DOT takes care of the 8,800 that carries about 87% of the traffic. The actual highway and bridge portion of that is relatively modest, and it might be competitive as opposed to formula. In other words, not guaranteed. That's still to be worked out. So that's not like a game changer for Maine DOT and our highway and bridge system, which will still remain the backbone of our system in a, like I say, a rural state like Maine. But they've also talked about reauthorization, talking about that could be a substantial increase too. So I think you have to talk about those together. So until we see what the proposal is for reauthorization, we really don't know about the highway and bridge side. There's a 85 billion proposed for transit, another 80 billion proposed for rail, including for the White House said for new lines and high potential locations. I don't know exactly what that means, Patricia, but I'm sure you can describe that. We did hear, because there is a lot of excitement about expansions, and I certainly understand that. But we did get a memo from the White House that said, no, you got to follow the existing new starts rules. So there's still density and all that kind of stuff, and ridership and all that. And then it rounds out with what's called transformative projects, and then aviation and ports. Because Maine has this is a great job, actually. I mean, as you know, Dana, you're in charge of a very vast multimodal transportation network. I talk about the highway system, but we also got 1,200 miles of rail. We have Amtrak service, and the best executive director of a rail service that anyone has in the country, taking care of that. And we have 3 major ports. We have a ferry service with 7 vessels and 7 islands, 21 transit providers with 420 buses running around the state. So it's there's never a dull moment, and there's a lot to take care of. And I think, again, a rising tide floats all boats, and the combination of the American Jobs Plan and reauthorization, I think, just means a rising tide. So that's good news for transportation in Maine.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think that you make a good point because it is what's being proposed. We're already hearing criticism from certain corners about there's not enough for the highway and bridge and transportation section of this. So to put it in partnership with the reauthorization makes sense. And maybe we need to hold that judgment until we see how both of them shape out. I would be concerned that it would be an application competitive process as opposed to a formula allocation. But again, as you handed out a bouquet to Patricia Quinn, and I would agree with that, I hand out a bouquet to you, my friend, because we are very fortunate to have you as Commissioner of Transportation. I leave you with one thought, though, as much as I do agree, and I think all of us do, that alternative vehicles and the electrical vehicle with supporting stations are vital to the environment and climate change. I know that there is a worry that having the fuel tax is not part of the equation when that occurs, and yet the impact on highways are still present. And how you make that work when the revenues can be less, this may be a major filler, if you will, but there still remains a challenge going forward.
Yeah, the vehicle miles traveled is very, politically sensitive to a lot of people. Rural areas just think it's going to hit them harder. Well, rural people are burning more gas to go to the grocery store already, and that's what the gas tax is. So, and by the way, you can set that policy however you want. The rural miles could be less than urban miles because they actually do cost less with all the infrastructure in an urban area. You could make that judgment. So it's not it doesn't have to be anti-rural. And but what it does require, and I'm happy to hear that there's going to be pilots in the federal legislation. When you get into small relatively small states. Like I say, Maine's a big state for the East Coast. You can fit all the rest of New England states in Maine. You get out west of the Mississippi and we're puny, right? We're about a third of the size of Nevada or something. So in big states like that, they've had some successful pilots. In states here where you can drive to your kid's college, you can go through 10 states in one day. That's going to require some federal leadership on that, because each state isn't going to be able to have their own system. And I just, in kind of closing, although highways and bridges is kind of like this foundational thing in a rural state like Maine, I reject the false choices that it's highways versus anything. It's not that. We all work together. Patricia does a great job, and we communicate about what she's doing and how does that fit into the broader whole with transit and others. And I just hate to, I think in some of the bigger cities, they have kind of positioned this as that highways and bridges bad, other modes good. And all I know is the future in a state like this is, electric cars and buses need highways and bridges too. That's going to be a big piece of it. And so it's still foundational, and I'd hate it to be either or and go with the rising tide floats all boats.
Well said. Thank you, Commissioner. We'll have you back to Maine Take when this is all resolved, and you can tell us about all of the new improvements that we expect to see. And by the way, that road in front of my house could use a lot of attention. You're right onto that, right?
Right on it. Thanks, Dana.
Take care of yourself. Let me turn my attention now to another very competent administrator that oversees our passenger rail service. She is the executive director of the Northern New England Passenger Rail Authority, and rail service that was seen as a wild card impossible was started in 2001. And since that time, to a great deal of her leadership, for which she's been recognized, frankly, nationwide for her commitment as well as success. We had close to 550,000 passengers in 2019. It probably would have exceeded 600,000 had the pandemic not gotten our way. So Patricia, it is great having you on the show, and I'm going to ask you the same thing. We don't have the details. We do not know of how it will necessarily affect Maine or how much we'll get from the proposal, whatever the proposal may be. But give us your sense of what it is that you do know that opens the door to opportunity for us here in Maine.
Well, thank you very much, Dana, and thank you all for the kind words. It's great to be here. This is a very exciting time, and as someone said, this really is just kind of the start of a conversation. It's not really a plan, but it's really exciting, and it's super exciting for us that passenger rail is part of this conversation. Three kind of pillars of this administration have been focused around the economy, the environment, and equity. And I think passenger rail really fits nicely with those, as does transit. So President Biden's infrastructure proposal includes $80 billion for freight and passenger rail, primarily passenger, but also freight. So I'm going to stop right there and just talk about infrastructure. You talk about railroad infrastructure, like the tracks that the Downeaster travels on every day is shared. The vast majority of that is shared with the freight carrier. So investments in rail infrastructure not only improves and benefits passenger rail, but also helps move freight in and out of our state as well. So that's an important component of that. Again, this is very high level. Of this $80 billion, right now, what we're hearing is a little more than half of that is going to be kind of dedicated to, or is proposed to be dedicated to backlog, infrastructure backlog. So bringing things into a state of good repair. In our world, that could mean, upgrading track and signal systems. It could be adding double track to give us the ability to have more trains going back and forth and being able to pass each other. And some of that is on the Northeast Corridor and some of it's off the Northeast Corridor. There's also a significant amount that's right now proposed to be used for expansion of passenger rail service and improvement. So something that would improve a service like the Downeaster that's been operating, or as you or the commissioner mentioned, looking to establish rail service that comes to new city pairs where our nation's rail network doesn't currently meet. So there's a lot there. And then there's some just for freight as well. And then to complement that, we always talk about the first and last mile connectivity. People get off a train, they don't have a car, they need to get to their ultimate destination. So the investments that are proposed, $85 billion to upgrade the transit network so people can, get back and forth to work, but also get to their destinations without the use of a private vehicle is also very exciting. So we're excited about that. Amtrak has put forth a vision that they're calling their 2035 plan. So that's put out a map, and lots of people are talking and buzzing about that. This isn't a plan, it's a map. And just because there's a line on the map doesn't mean that there's going to be a train there. And if there isn't a line connecting two cities, it doesn't mean that there isn't going to be a train there. Again, it's just an idea of what the types of investments that could be made to grow the nation's passenger rail network. And we really look forward to working with our congressional delegation. We've been very fortunate in Maine to have strong support on the state level and also on the federal level. Our congressional delegation, all of them, have been big proponents of a balanced multimodal transportation network. Passenger rail has benefited from that, and we look forward to working with everyone to move the ball forward.
Well, I think just by your testimonial right there that people can clearly understand why the Downeaster has been so successful, why we have nearly 600,000 passengers, and why you are being honored throughout the country for your leadership.
Thank you.
Pretty much said it all, and we're grateful that you're in that position. So thanks, Patricia. It's great having your show, and we'll have you back as well on Main Take to talk about how all of this came together and how it ultimately, finally affects the things that you put forward. So thanks for being with us. It means a lot.
Thank you.
So Peter Van Allen has been patiently waiting by, and we welcome him back. He, as many of you know, you see him every time Maine Biz publication comes out. He is their editor, and we have him on to tell us about the latest project, the good news things that he's working on for the state of Maine. Peter, it's great having you with us.
Thanks, Dana. I'm enjoying this conversation. It's a great topic, and this is somewhat related, perhaps. I'm back talking about the construction and real estate business, but an interesting story that came up in Maine Biz last week. One of the bigger stories was involves a sixth generation company, Hancock Lumber. Hancock Lumber is based in Casco. It has about 550 employees, 200 million in sales, reportedly. They bought another family-owned lumberyard business, LaPointe Lumber. It was a very strategic deal for Hancock because if you look at the map of where they're located, before this acquisition, they had 9 locations. The hole in the donut was the Augusta Gardner area. So now they buy LaPointe Lumber, and they pick up lumber yards in Augusta and in Gardner. So Hancock Lumber now has 11 lumber yards. They also, in addition to owning the lumber yards, they also supply lumber yards and supply lumber because they have their own sawmills. So this actually gives them 2 more outlets to sell their own lumber at Hancock Lumber. So they have 11 lumber yards, 3 sawmills, and they also have these kitchen design stores, 8 of those. So it's something, I think, a trend we've seen a little bit of is you have 2 major players, and I'm not including Home Depot or Lowe's in this discussion, but you have Hancock Lumber and Hammond Lumber. Right. Both have kind of red and white logos. They're very, very similar businesses in many ways, both family owned, both longtime legacy businesses in Maine. And they've been buying up some of their smaller competitors if you will, these smaller family-owned lumber yards. Hammond Lumber bought EBS. Forgive me, I think that was Ellsworth Building Supplies originally.
Right.
They
Yeah.
had 10 locations. That deal was in 2018. And this might be something that we'd see more of in coming years as some of these smaller lumber yards, the owners are ready to kind of pass on the business. But that was a big story for us in the past.
Well, it's a big story also for the state of Maine because we're extremely proud of those two family-owned business, Hancock and Hammond. As a matter of fact, we put out a magazine that's One Voice Maine, and this edition will focus on innovation, 100 years of innovation, and the grounding of that is on fishing, farming, and forestry. And we've also listed companies that were here 100 years ago that still exist today. Both of those are companies that their families created them, and they've carried on the outstanding Maine tradition. So thank you very much for bringing that to our attention. We greatly appreciate it. It's nice to celebrate those special occasions. One last thing I want to ask of you, because you and Bruce both have Van in your names. Did I introduce you as Peter Van Nolt? I hope I introduced you as Peter Van Allen.
Dana, if you did, I didn't.
Good. Good. Well, yeah, you both confused me. That Van threw me off stride, but I think I got you Peter Van Allen. If I didn't, I apologize. But great having you on the show. We look forward to seeing you right back here, but it'll be Tuesday at noontime next week. So thanks. Always look forward to your segment. It's always good news. I love it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Now let's turn to my staff. They are very good at what they do, but they don't always have good news. We're going to find out what they have to offer today. Of course, those three are Peter Gore, Ben Gilman, and Linda Caprera. And if Linda's on, she'll be coming to us, I think, by phone, perhaps by Zoom. But Peter, do you want to give us an indication of a bill or two that you're working on this month? As we've all come to know, is a month of hearings because the legislature has adjourned, not coming back until special session, the 28th of this month. In the meantime, committees are hard at it to have hearings. So Peter, as well as the other two, can you start us off, Peter, by telling us what you're working on as an example?
Sure, Dana, and thanks. Well, today was minimum wage day in the Labor Committee. They heard 5 different minimum wage bills, 2 of which would implement a municipal preemption on minimum wages other than what the state would enact. One was to set a youth wage. One was to index the minimum wage on an every 3-year basis instead of every year. And then one bill would raise the minimum wage to $16 an hour. The committee was extremely efficient getting through the testimony. They were done by noontime, and now the bills will be scheduled for work session. I don't predict that any of them will go very far, but we have to wait and see. Wednesday is a big day, though. There are a number of bills in work session before the Labor Committee. They'll be the first work sessions. Some of the more important bills that we're following will have LD 607, which is the overtime standard bill, which changes the wage threshold that separates an hourly from a salaried employee, will be worked on. And LD 553, the bill that would eliminate employment at will in Maine, will also be taken up in a work session. So we'll have to wait and see where those bills go. Important day leading into the school vacation week. I know this morning we talked a little bit about whether there would be committee work or not because it is school vacation week, but lo and behold, since our meetings this morning, a number of different committees have announced that they will be working and they've got full schedules, including the Judiciary Committee, which has a bill that we're following, 1294. So, Ben?
Yeah, thanks. There's one bill I want to bring to people's attention that's being heard this week that I think is a good bill, and it's LD 1088. It has to do with career and technical education here in the state of Maine. And what it does is a few years back, as we set a minimum teacher salary for $40,000 a year for teachers or when you enter the teaching profession. Believe it or not, it was probably an oversight. That didn't include instructors for technical education centers around the state of Maine. Some of them do recognize that and start them at $40,000, but not all of them. So Bill LD 1088 looks to bring parity to teaching in the state of Maine in terms of raising up the level of career and technical education instructors to that minimum $40,000 base level. And I think that's really important. We all know how important the career and technical education centers play in our workforce, especially our workforce of tomorrow, training folks coming out of high school with those certificates of value or those licensures as they come out. So I think it's important that we recognize them on the same level as we do the classroom teachers. So the Education Committee is going to be hearing that bill this week. It's a good bill. I suspect it's not going to be a lot of opposition to it, but it's a good one as we move forward as a state and we look at workforce development. So that's one bill I want to recognize. Linda, you might want to talk about a tax bill or two.
Yeah, there's a bill in taxation on Thursday, public hearing. We're going to be opposing it. It's LD 428. What this bill would do is require corporations to include in their income from certain jurisdictions around outside the U.S., certain countries. There's a whole list of them when apportioning their income to Maine. There's a lot of changes potentially at the federal level that are going to come down. President Biden is making some proposals that will really kind of change or expand the taxation of foreign income. So what we're going to do is ask the committee to basically carry this bill over pending a lot of potential changes down, this spring and summer, with the other stimulus that's coming. So that's kind of where we're at in taxation. That's probably the most important bill this week. Back to you, Dana.
Okay, Linda, thank you, Ben and Peter. My gratitude to each and every one of you. Thanks for bringing to our public's attention some of the issues that we're watching. And we plan to do that every program that we have to try to keep you abreast of those issues that do make a difference, either in a positive way or they may stand in your way. So thanks, guys and gal. This part is the toughest for me because I have to try to summarize coherently, at least try to do it coherently, the takeaway for the week. And I guess it's pretty obvious that the infrastructure and jobs plan was the topic of a good part of this program. It was President Biden's $2.3 trillion plan that was intended to improve the economy. That was the reasoning behind it. The message was perhaps subtle, but nevertheless, to me, very evident, which was you pay now or you pay later. And as Ed mentioned early on, that this is not the only occasion that infrastructure or jobs have been a paramount reaction to a declining economy or to one that was struggling. Time and again, that presidents have put forward packages to help kickstart the economy when periods of depression or major recessions took place or other catastrophes. No, it's not unique. In this case, his $2.3 trillion plan, the plan that President Biden puts forward, really has, in summary, 4 categories. And it was something that USA Today put forward just recently. One certainly is transportation infrastructure. Here you have your roads, your bridges, your rail. You have a focus on clean energy vehicles, electric vehicles, as we heard our commissioner speak to. Another category of spending was the quality of life at home. And this was the largest expenditure that was proposed in President Biden's plan. Whereas transportation infrastructure was $615 billion, the quality of life at home was $650 billion. And here it was about looking at housing, the shortage of supply. It looked at schools, broadband, the power grid, clean drinking water, childcare was included in that. The third category that was referenced in USA Today was the caregivers for elderly and people with disability. Here it was to provide more access to in-home care. Here it was to raise the level of wages for those who experience or who have those responsibilities. And clearly there was a focus on those who occupied those positions, people of color or lower income people. The fourth category that the USA brought forward as they looked at this program to summarize it had to do with R&D and manufacturing. Here it was training for workers in the clean economy. It was about research to further climate change awareness. It was research for the semiconductor and manufacturing industry. But a large part of it had to do with trying to bring back to our shores from foreign shores the domestic production that's so important to our economy. But there's also another summary, and Patricia Quinn referenced it, that categorize, when you look at them in the broadest of sense, is that it's about the economy, it's about the environment, and yes, it's about equity. Either way, it is a program, a plan that's bold. As the president released it, these were his words. These are investments we have to make. He also said, put another way, we can't afford not to. The program today, as well as those words that he used, took me back to my 11 years at DOT, in which every commissioner has always struggled for more money to help meet the needs of transportation. The message that I used to use frequently in those 11 years to get people's attention and make them realize the value of transportation was to remind them that it's the foundation of our economy, that it costs a lot to build and maintain a sound transportation system, but it costs a lot more not to. It's true, it does take a lot of money, lots of dollars. But that's our goal, is to try to move people and products safely and efficiently, and you can't let the system fall in disrepair. And that's why they say it costs a lot more not to. It not only has an effect on the economy, but every year you to delay the cost to repair that, the cost goes up accordingly. Now, there's no easy way, there's no inexpensive way. It does cost a lot, but it costs a lot more not to. Well, that's the plan, that's the proposal. Congress is going to take it under advisement. You're going to hear that it's too large. You're going to hear the specifics on what is being proposed to be spent and where it should be spent or not spent. We're going to find, hopefully, how much of that will come to our state of Maine, and most of all, how are we going to fund it? Well, the proposal today is what we do know. That we can predict. But what we can't predict, because we don't know, because this is the beginning and not the end, is what is the final package going to be like, and how will Maine benefit? I do believe, as has been suggested, that a compromise will be reached. It will pass, and it will be signed into law because it's needed. We can't afford not to, as the president says. And as also we have come to know, you pay now or you pay later. And yes, even though I'm taking liberties of what I used to say during those 11 years, rebuilding an economy costs a lot, but it costs a lot more not to. That is my takeaway for this week. I thank our sponsors, I thank our guests, and I thank all of you for being with us. Look forward to seeing you right back here next Tuesday. Remember, it's at noon, not at 3. And in the meantime, take care of yourself and take care of one another. Have a great week. Look forward to seeing you next Tuesday at noon. Thanks. Take care.